Today we are diving into part 3 of the Politics&War Iceberg. If you haven't watched the videos before this one, you should check them out. In them I explain some of the most common beliefs in the community. This video will be different because we will be discussing the game's secrets, conspiracies, and events, which some alliances would rather forget. Disclaimer, the beliefs and events discussed in this video are being discussed by some fragment of the community. They are not necessarily true, and just because I discuss them does not mean I believe or support any of them. Tier 5 Radio Shows. Information about VC in general. It tends to be older players, 20 to 40, and the younger players stay away from the older ones for obvious reasons, so it's good to preface this tier by saying don't share personal information, don't get too friendly with these people, only discuss the game, and if they're being creepy, instantly block them. It doesn't matter who they are or how important they claim to be. Don't get caught up in drama, block and ignore. Events happening on radio. Fake interviews. Great Job was a radio show created by two important diplomats in Politics and War. It helped revolutionize radio in the community by increasing audience engagement and adding pre-produced clips. Unfortunately, they took this too far and faked an interview in an especially nasty way. The hosts dug up an old interview with the Alliance leader Quentin. The interview was taken at a very low point in his life, and he was evidently distraught in the recording. The hosts then cut up the recording and added their own questions in a calm voice. It sounded like they were asking simple and reasonable questions, and Quentin was going crazy. A surprising number of people thought the recording was real, and ultimately the hosts apologized and stopped sharing the file they made and doing this sort of thing. However, this was not an isolated incident. In the Nationstates community, and audio cannot be fully trusted anymore. IQ's split was fake. For context, the Inquisition bloc disbanded in early 2019, and the member alliances created two new blocs with former adversaries. During the Great War, when they reunited, and people presumed the split was fake because of this. In a radio show called Hivemind, run by the former leaders of the Inquisition, then they sort of admitted the split was fake, and explained in more detail the advantages of working together. The biggest advantage of working together was that they didn't have to work against each other. When they worked together, their tiering was an impenetrable defensive wall. However, if they worked against each other, it would be devastating. They were each other's greatest possible allies and worst possible enemies. EMC's split was fake. Easy Mode Coalition was a really large and powerful coalition that included the Syndicate, the Knights Radiant, and Rose at its height. It was also an arch rival to the Inquisition. After defeating the Inquisition, then it disbanded, and the aforementioned member alliances each went their separate ways. At least that's the public version of events. Borhan and others have revealed on radio shows the EMC never fully dissolved, and there were still secret treaties and non-aggression pacts. And Borhan is quite unique in that he was leadership in EMC for quite a long time, and in TKR after the coalition disbanded. So he would have known if it was fake, and he has little to no incentive to lie. I'm not sure he used this example of it being fake, but it is the one that comes to mind. In 2017, the Church of Spaceology planned to attack the Syndicate, and more or less, the Knights Radiant threatened to defend them. GPWC didn't break the rules. In a series of radio shows during the Great War, then the New Pacific Order claimed that Alex was aware of the nature of GPWC, and permitted it. They provided screenshots of their conversations with him during these radios as well. Last I checked, then Alex claimed he was informed but not told the entire story. There was a joke at the time circling that you could hire someone to play Politics and War, but not to give you resources, and that payment could come in any form, but that which would be illegal, like translating copyrighted manhwa. I'm not sure that the jokes were accurate. If you wanted to do that, I would check with Alex and read the GPWC ban reports in depth. Peace terms disappeared after the Great War. Thalmor Radio, Morph Radio, and Royal Radio have all claimed peace terms are good for the game's story. For example, if someone loses a war, then the victor could make them fly a funny flag, or pay reparations. This might motivate the defeated alliance to seek revenge and make for an interesting story. This prompts an interesting question. Why are peace terms so rare if the radio shows all support them? Well, the radio shows believe it's because Coalition B tried to impose such harsh peace terms during the Great War that no one wants to be compared to them. I disagree. I think if you watched most of the radio shows from 2016 to 2020, you'd realize that peace terms started small and got harsher and more numerous over time, climaxing at nightfall and almost in the Great War. None of the radio shows have criticized Nightfall's peace terms, even though they are remarkably similar to the Great War's potential peace terms. I think the reason we don't see peace terms anymore is that they do inspire revenge. People forget, but Coalition B was composed of alliances that lost almost a dozen global wars against alliances in Coalition A. Alliances in Coalition B had banks stolen, flags changed, leadership deposed, infrastructure capped to low amounts, military capped at low amounts. Hell, some of them were made into protectorates. After half a decade of suffering peace terms, Coalition B got to impose some, and Coalition A was terrified. I think the reason that Pandora's box has remained sealed is because they realize that if they open it, they will invite another great war. Celebrities. The hosts and guests on radio shows can become celebrities within the community, and the recognizability gives them the power to shape the public's perception of their alliance. If they are a nice person, then their alliance must contain nice people, and if they are critical of their alliance, then the issue must be very serious. I've mentioned stakeholders in other videos, and presumably elsewhere on the iceberg. If a leader of a major alliance makes unpopular political decisions, their high government and important stakeholders within the alliance will tell people to leave and protest until the political decision is reverted. Celebrities are stakeholders, and they do this all the time. They even form celebrity alliances that last for a few months before inevitably imploding, like some content creator house. And if you're wondering why that's inevitable, it's because all the celebrities want to be the most important person in the alliance, and those that don't want to be number one want to leech off the other's fame, and there's a limit on how much they can grow in someone else's shadow. 2021 awards were unacceptable. At the end of every year, then the community votes on who the best players and alliances were. Usually the vote is held on the forums, but once or twice it was held in-game with a mass message. Typically, the alliances or blocks with the most members win the most awards. So for the 2021 awards, the hosts changed how voting worked so that the winners were decided by a popular vote and a vote by the top 60 alliances. Those votes should have been combined, but they weren't. At the last minute, then the hosts decided to keep them separate. This meant that many of the most important categories had no clear winner. The only reason they would do this is because the outcome would have been politically unacceptable. When you look at the categories with two winners, it's very obvious which alliances were motivated to split the vote. And it's not just about winning awards, it's about not winning the bad ones. And if you're still on the fence and you don't think that's what happened, you should watch the full award show. After naming some of the winners, they tear them apart and unanimously say someone else should have won. There's no proper speeches or explanations for why they won. It's all political. For the record, I won 3 awards decisively in both the popular and alliance vote. The most any player has won, and I didn't vote, and neither did my alliance. You are the worst leader I've ever heard of. But you have heard of me. Also, since it's really funny, I'm going to play an excerpt from the awards show, Morph Radio, and Thalma Radio. It demonstrates how much changes in 10 months.
Into worst alliance leader, the best category out of all. The OWF alliance representatives, again, unanimous. Take a guess, chat. It's Epimetheus. We all knew it was coming.
Yep, best villain. Epi won both voting categories.
Sure, yeah. Most controversial player. If I could get to the right tab, there we go. We had a unanimous vote here. Both the Alliance reps and the OWF nominated our good friend and constant award winner, Epi, as the most controversial player of the year.
He's racking awards.
Actually, we have someone in this VC who is an example of what can be done when you innovate. I think that Epi has steered Camelot reasonably well since he's become leader. I know that's
Wait a
probably
minute.
a controversial thing to say.
Are you endorsing Camelot? Lana, this may be your worst FA take I've ever heard.
Their FA is more interesting than GGO's. Way more interesting than GGO's.
Damn. That is a spicy hot take.
But like, people have been incredibly toxic to Epi and Camelot over the years, and people have been incredibly toxic to
every post ever made.
Are we really not going to talk about how that's literally all Ron's fault?
I got to put that somewhere.
I mean, I've got to say, Camelot is doing pretty well for how I think they would have been doing at this point if I had thought about it a year ago. To be perfectly honest, they were kind of in the shitter, and they've gone pretty high
That's
up.
true. I honestly expected Camelot to disband.
Right,
So
right.
props to
I feel
Epi
like
for
they've
saving
done
them from
pretty
that,
well,
I guess.
given the
You're a
circumstances
hero.
they were in.
I actually sort of agree with Juana in a way, to be honest. I gotta give it to Epi. The dude's hella resistant. Like, I have no doubt Camelot's gonna be around probably forever.
Yeah.
I will admit
Honestly.
it, like, it's impressive in that regard.
Epi genuinely has his own empire. There is no argument against this. Okay, if you argue against what I'm saying, it is just a cope. Epi is an emperor, and he has done it by his own hands. And like, he makes videos for the community, and like, I challenge anyone else to take over an alliance like he did, like he took over Camelot, to restructure it in his own image, to build a new government, and to assemble a collection of alliances under his wing. I challenge you to mimic his success. A lot of people probably can't, or maybe they can and are unwilling to. But he struck it out. He did it. He did it.
KT were cowards. The Knights Templar was renowned as the alliance with the best fighters in 2017. They earned this reputation without fighting any wars. They just had enough competent members that people believed it. In late 2017, this changed, and KT were labeled cowards by a number of powerful alliances. No one really understood why until it was revealed on radio shows several years later. Knights Templar had agreed to attack the Commonwealth during the Global War in 2017, but at the last minute, they backed out. They went on to fight a lot of wars and prove their military reputation, but they lost 75% of their members in the process, falling from almost 200 members to 45. Syndicate's grudges. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the Syndicate, one alliance under SNEC, with ROI and growth for all. Furthermore, I am of the opinion that UPN must be destroyed. This was, and may still be, a pledge that every new member of the Syndicate makes when they join. It's made in jest, but reflects their alliance's grudge against UPN. This grudge, and that against Freudian Entente, are infamous, and often the subject of discussion on radio shows. The grudge against VE is particularly interesting, because VE no longer exists, and the Syndicate has prevented it reforming a few times, rolling Order Verde and stealing the name Viridian Entente and giving it to their protectorates are the most recent actions in that story. Fragold's bluff. Fragold started building nuclear weapons when they were first introduced to the game. Unlike every other player, she didn't stop. The upkeep on nuclear weapons was very low, and each one added 50 score to your nation. At Fragold's height, she had over 1,000 nukes and a 14,000 score. That said, each time she went to buy a nuke, she had to pay 30 million in military upkeep, and then spend 6 million to buy the nuke, which was rather challenging for a City 14 at a time when it was harder to make money. She bought a lot of nukes with donations. However, some of the donations were not voluntary, which is why it's on this list. Fragold threatened to nuke lots of major alliances unless they donated. She had thousands of nukes, and her score was high enough that she could drop them on large nations with lots of infrastructure. It was a legitimate threat, and some people even tried to spy her nukes away to minimize the damage when they refused to pay. Ultimately, Fragold never nuked anyone, and when Alex capped how much score you gained from nuclear weapons, she quit. Lots of radio shows look back and say she was bluffing. She never intended to nuke anyone. It just made her an interesting character and helped her get donations. And it was quite an accomplishment. She featured in Drew Donnell's video as the largest nation, though somehow he missed that this was entirely through nukes. And the largest nations in the game right now have at most 12,000 score, which is still less than her peak, and these nations have 45 or more cities compared to her 14. Rose Anniversary Radio. Rose's entire history was recapped in an anniversary radio show that lasted for more than 3 hours. It's very rare that alliances go into detail about their history, and they have been one of the most powerful alliances in the game since it started, so it's definitely worth listening to, if you can suffer the fluff. Seven Kingdoms radios. The Seven Kingdoms was a very prominent alliance in early PNW, and in other nation sims. They ran a number of radio shows for PNW and these other nation sims. I haven't listened to them all, but I do plan to at some point. There is just so much history there. They might have even hosted the first radio in PNW, which is on YouTube. Alex was a guest, and they asked him for his opinion on the top 10 alliances, which has remained a staple of PNW interviews ever since. Check out the Seven Kingdoms website. As I was researching this video, I discovered this page explaining the origin of paperless and Project Terror. Paperless is an important ideology in PNW, and the article is very accurate and refutes some common misconceptions. Modern radios. Seven Kingdoms, the anniversary shows, and Prefontaine's radio shows are very different from the modern radios we have now. All of the modern radio shows originated with Bad Company. This one alliance, themed around music, coincidentally envisioned reforming all of the radios and using them to reshape the community and grow their political influence. This isn't speculation. I was in that alliance, and I had access to the channels where they were planning it. Intro songs and theme songs, pre-produced advertisements, competitions and events, articles behind paywalls like real news sites, hosting debates between lots of leaders, more interaction with live audiences, discussion of real politics. The modern radios are very different from before. Some of it is great, and other parts are just terrible. Mercenaries and proxies. I've mentioned mercenaries and proxies elsewhere on the Iceberg, but they featured in Borhan's radio in a unique way. For context, Borhan once led a mercenary alliance named the Golden Horde, and his guest, named Abbas, was once Rose's chief diplomat and one of the most influential players in the game. Borhan mentioned that during AC, the global war in 2018, then Abbas paid him and his alliance to fight. Supposedly, he was paid $5 billion, which at the time was a very large amount of money, and filled their war chest for the year. Abbas later admitted that he was secretly funding all the attacks against DMC prior to Rose joining. It's very rare for people and alliances to reveal information on mercenaries and proxies, despite how common they are. If we had more radios on subjects like this, the game as a whole would be a lot smarter. Radio generalizations. Recordings. If you talk about politics, presume you are being recorded. A good portion of the game is from America and the rest of the Western world, and the laws around recording other people are varied, and even more people don't care about them. With that said, recording other people is kind of unethical, and generally, those found doing it are treated with suspicion and excluded from conversations. Voice changes. A lot of the time the voice you're hearing is heavily modified by programs. A famous voice actor even joined the community and used a particularly powerful voice changer to prevent people learning their real identity. 70% fluff. 70% of all the radio shows is fluff. In a 1-hour radio, perhaps 10 minutes involves analysis of politics or game mechanics. The outcome is already determined. Radio hosts tend to invite guests to build them up or tear them down. There's rarely a genuine interest, and people enter these radios with preconceived notions and objectives. Unless you join the radio knowing they're going to be friendly, then expect them to tear you down and keep your guard up. Training. The big alliances train their members in government for radio shows. When I was learning how to handle these radio shows from Rose, then they explained that metaphors were especially useful to convey ideas, and if someone is trying to take you down, you can answer questions with questions and go off on your own tangents to say what you want to say. You see this concept applied in American political debates, where a candidate is asked a question and they ignore it and read off their script. The frequency of radios. The number of radio shows peaked first in 2018 with a few regular shows, and then again in 2022 with a few regular shows and lots of one-offs. There's been at least one radio show a week for the past year. However, the radio shows are becoming less regular. Thelma Radio is bi-weekly. Morph Radio is once every few months. Royal Radio is once every 6 months. I don't think there's a content drought, but it feels like there is because of how shallow the analysis of events is. And yes, I'm saying that during an Iceberg video whilst providing a very shallow analysis of dozens of events. Nothing's perfect and not everyone wants a super detailed analysis. I think next year we will see even more new radios. They won't analyze things differently, all the opinions and information will ultimately be the same, but they will deliver the information with a different personality. For example, some alliance loses a war. One radio host calls them trash and points out all their failings before concluding that they'll never improve. Another radio host calls them bad and points out all their failings before concluding that they need to improve but likely won't. One of the hosts will have a very smooth voice, and another will be yelling from inside a jet turbine. Alliance voice chats. Some alliances voice chat every day or every week. There are not many decisions to make in PNW, even for major alliances, but those decisions can be very well thought out. I expect we'll see more exclusive alliance radios develop at some point. There are already Q&As and alliance announcements that happen via voice chat. The Lost Radios. Archive.org has hundreds of hours of Politics and War and Cybernations radios. Tier 6. Buried in the chat. There are hundreds of thousands of posts across Cybernations and Politics and War's forums, the individual alliance forums, and the game updates. And there are millions of posts across hundreds of Discord servers related to Politics and War. There is an unfathomable amount of content that is literally impossible to sort through. This tier will include a number of really interesting things that I have found buried in the chat. This is not an exhaustive list. Pixel Nations code. Before Alex created Politics and War, he created Pixel Nations. I forget why, but he sold the game to Greeny and started developing Politics and War. Within a week, Greeny discovered a game-breaking bug and he didn't know a way to fix it, so the game went offline. A few years later, Greeny open-sourced Pixel Nations by posting its code on GitHub. People have attempted to restart the game since then, but so far no one succeeded. When I was making this video, that's all I knew about the Pixel Nations code, but when I was getting feedback on the first Iceberg video, I heard something crazy from someone that played Pixel Nations. I'm just going to read out their messages on the topic. These are not my opinions. The bug that killed Pixel Nations was an infinite money bug that was purposefully coded in. I expressed some doubt. Wait, Alex purposefully broke his own game. And he replied, it's not known if it was Alex 100%. Back then, Alex allowed community members to help build the game from what I can understand, and someone he trusted could have added it. But yeah, it was a hidden button basically that spawned something like 1 billion. Accusations of cheating and breaking the law are pretty common in this community, so take it with a grain of salt. I personally don't believe Alex did that, but the code is there if anyone wants to conduct their own investigation. Also, since this is somewhat related, it's rumored that the code from Pixel Nations was reused in early Politics and War, but most people agree it's been entirely phased out. The Great Deflation. On the 9th of July 2017, Alex posted an update called The Great Deflation. I'm going to read the foreword before explaining it. Ah yes, it's about that time again. It's been far too long since I've released a heinous update to upset the player base and encourage cries for my head on a pike. The game was created in 2013, and by 2017, nations had become so wealthy that the game became unbalanced. To fix this, then Alex halved resource production, lowered cash revenue, and doubled pollution, which prevented people producing lots of resources without destroying their cash revenue. In response, the market did this. A year later, then Sketchy posted the 4th most popular thread in the game's history, asking Alex to revert the changes. The primary issue with the update was that it directly disincentivized alliances to invest in newer players, and the reason that prices soared was because supply was dramatically reduced, but demand wasn't, leading to, and I quote, Venezuela-like shortages. The MK and MPO grudge. The Knights Radiance founders came from an alliance called the Mushroom Kingdom in Cybernations. The Mushroom Kingdom was the arch-enemy of the New Pacific Order, and supposedly, the grudge between their alliances carried over to PNW and lasted a decade and a half. The TKR members might give me a lot of flack for including this, since they tried to distinguish themselves, but it was an important topic of discussion for a very long time. Everyone is MPO. You cannot go anywhere in the PNW community without hearing about how MPO is the greatest evil to ever walk this earth. Whether they are or not is a subject for debate, but what's interesting is that a lot of the leaders and important players were, or are, currently members of MPO. The Syndicate's leader Wana founded an unofficial branch of MPO in PNW. Cathargo's leader Davith is a member of MPO and Nationstates. Arg was founded by a former member of MPO, Ogaden. Order of the White Rose, now disbanded, was founded by a former member of MPO, Saval. and the Immortals head of FA is former MPO, James Wilson. There are plenty of others too. I find it very strange for two reasons. Firstly, the Immortals tiering and block strategy is very similar to MPO's, and they have never been criticized for it. I don't understand why that is. Carthago's economy is very similar to MPO's, and so is their theming, but they do not receive any criticism either. In fact, Polaris, the sister alliance of MPO, still exists, but there is no criticism. Secondly, the Syndicate, Carthago, and Order of the White Rose attacked Camelot in 2021, and one of their justifications for war was that Camelot was acting like MPO. That might make sense, except no one in Camelot had ever been a member of MPO, and all of their enemies had been. Carthago's leadership was currently in MPO for the duration of that war, and objectively, Carthago's economic system was a carbon copy of MPO's at the time, whereas Camelot's was not. If you think about it, for more than 2 seconds, it's kinda mind-blowing. I think a lot of the community both hates and respects MPO. Goons loan. Rose loaned $6 billion to Goons when they invaded the game during the Great War. They loaned Goons this money whilst they were aligned with their enemy, Coalition B, and actively plotting to destroy them. The Knights Radiant and the Syndicate were also trying to ally Goons at the time in order to remove them from Coalition B. Most of the community looks back and criticizes Goons and blames Coalition B for empowering them. What the community doesn't realize is that Coalition B didn't empower them. Their enemies did. Coalition A was in large part to blame for Goons' rapid rise in power. When will the superpowers learn? Don't feed the beasts you're scared of. They won't be grateful. They will eat you next. Yeah, it is true. They're so stupid. They do it every time. IQ Bank Mystery. At the end of the Great War, then the New Pacific Order, Black Knights, Guardians of the Galaxy, and Goons disbanded. The NPO Bank disappeared. The Black Knights Bank passed to Goons, and Guardians of the Galaxy spent their bank on the moon landing projects. So that leaves two questions. What happened to the Goons Bank and the NPO Bank? Well, Goons was allied to Advanced Syndicalist Mechanics, ASM, and they are the most likely candidate to have received the Goons and BK Bank. ASM was an ally of Rose, so it's possible they repaid the loan Goons had taken from Rose during the war. This might explain why Rose never complains about losing their investment. The MPO Bank might have also ended up with Goons, and ultimately ASM, but another likely candidate is Polaris, otherwise known as the New Polar Order. Polaris was created by MPO in 2006, and remains a sister alliance that might be holding their bank for them in case they ever decide to return. Polaris is currently allied to the new Black Knights, which would further support the theory. Reparations to allies. Reparations are only paid when you lose an offensive war or you attack someone by mistake, and typically people only pay a few $100 million at most. However, there have been a few cases where alliances have had to pay their allies reparations for stupid reasons. The first example is the Inquisition, paying $6 billion to Polaris for involving them in AC, a global war in 2018. For context, they were paid more than the Mercenaries fighting against them, and $6 billion was 6 times more than the highest reparations ever paid by an enemy alliance leading up to that war. It's almost twice as much as the current record of $4 billion. That begs the question, why did the Inquisition pay these reparations? Well, Polaris was considering cancelling their treaty, so I expect it was also a bribe to keep them on side. Another example is MPO paying several billion to the Assassin Order. MPO's allies attacked Assassin Order for leaking war plans and plotting against them, and MPO felt bad for them and covered their rebuild. The PNW Illuminati. Early in the game's history, then Alex invited the leaders of every major alliance to a secret server to ask for advice on game updates. This is why major alliances adapted to game updates so quickly, and catch-up mechanics were rarely, if ever, introduced. With that said, the major alliances didn't get everything they wanted, as proven by the Great Deflation. That server has since been replaced by the design team, which is composed of a small pool of leaders and active players selected by Prefontaine, one of the most powerful players in PNW's early history, and now a close friend of Alex. The PNW Illuminati may not have the same power or form as it once did, but it still exists. At least now everyone knows it exists and who's in it. The index pages. Very few players know about the index pages, even though they are very easy to access. Click on the Trade tab and you will be redirected to the Trade page. However, unlike other pages, the URL doesn't say trade, it says index.php ID 26. Every single page in Politics and War can be found through the index. If you change the URL from 26 to 27 and press enter, you will be taken to the Create Trade Offer page. You might be thinking, neat, I can now randomly visit pages I can already find normally. Yes, that is something you can do. You can also find hidden pages as well. I'll list the interesting ones so you don't have to search hundreds of index pages. There is an IRC terminal, there are unfinished mechanics, there are old tutorials, and there are performance indicators that show you how the game is growing. There's a multi-detector, a graph showing Alliance score over the past 30 days, an unfinished war stats tool from before stats were displayed on the war history pages, and a teacher even got their whole class to join the game and compete with one another. There were more than 30 of them at one point, though if memory serves, one player role-playing as the Germans during World War II rolled the others out of the game. It's against the rules to do that sort of roleplay, so I think they had a special exception. The admin panels. There are a number of index pages that I collectively refer to as the admin panels. One page allows you to rename alliances, change the permissions of members, change the contents of banks, and more. And there is also a panel which allows you to rename other people's nations, change their resources, and delete their military units. I used to check the index pages fairly often to get advance notice of game updates, and I stumbled upon the nation panel once or twice and reminded Alex to hide it. For the record, I didn't give myself a trillion resources, although it would have been hilarious. Abusing bugs is against the rules. I'm not quite sure why it was randomly left open. I assume he didn't want to log in with his admin account, or he wanted to access it from one of the accounts he was using to spy on alliances. Regardless, he's got better at hiding it, and now if you visit those pages, you will see a little message saying your account doesn't have permission to see the panels. Unit perks. I already mentioned there are unfinished mechanics on some of the index pages. Well, a neutral and pacifist alliance named the Green Protection Agency is the reason we don't have a skill tree or tech tree for military units. Alex proposed the change and even coded it into the game, as the index page demonstrates, but GPA successfully lobbied against it. You can visit the game suggestion thread to see their arguments, but for context, as a pacifist alliance, GPA called for war itself to be removed. Thankfully, Alex ignored those calls, otherwise this game would literally be called Politics and Farm. The Fork. The game's top diplomats occasionally meet in real life to improve relationships between their alliances. This can be very dangerous, so I would advise against it in 99% of cases. With that disclaimer, I'm going to be talking about a few of the most interesting meetups that I've heard of. Number 1. The high government of a top 30 alliance went on a camping trip. That alone would be interesting, that an enemy spy learned about it, so when they all arrived in the mountains, their alliance was attacked, and they didn't have enough cell reception to defend. Apparently their leader saw what happened, turned off his phone, and relayed what happened to the rest of the government whilst they cooked s'mores around the fire. I don't know how much of that is propaganda, but regardless, it's hilarious. Meetings at bars are quite common. EVE Online has had a number of high-profile meetups at bars, especially after major events, but these meetups rarely have any significance. In late 2018, then Guardians of the Galaxy defeated Bad Company in a war, and as part of the peace terms, then Bad Company had to gift them a fork, a real-life piece of cutlery. Rather than mail it, they elected a representative to meet up and share a beer before transferring the cutlery. I did say a few meetups, so I guess I'll mention this one too. One of PNW's most influential figure was an active police officer a number of years ago. Another player called the police and was put through to them purely by chance, and it led to one of the strangest exchanges ever, because the first thing they said is that you? And they said their username. I don't think most people would be prepared for that, but it's an interesting example of how many people play this game and how small the world really is. Permanent activity. Some nations have been online 24/7 for more than half a decade. Some nations have done this intentionally, by using scripts so that none of their enemies know their time zone. However, most of these nations have done this unintentionally, because until recently, scripts had to log into your nation to send recruitment messages web scrape pages, and make bank withdrawals. Development podcasts. Alex has a series of development podcasts on SoundCloud. He also has Politics and War videos on the Politics and War YouTube channel and the Alex Winchell channel. He has also used a bunch of more obscure sites to upload content. Oh, and he has appeared on Politics and War radio shows and indie game podcasts. In all of these podcasts, then Alex will discuss possible updates, most of which will never come to fruition. But some of them have. Leaders in the military. A lot of Politics and War's leaders are in the military, and every time there's a major deployment, then a lot of them will resign from leadership at once. It's kinda wild because with new leadership and new attitudes, the politics changes quite a lot. Everything is logged. Almost every diplomatic discussion is logged and shared with the Alliance's leadership. The only time this doesn't happen is when the Alliance is a dictatorship and the leader doesn't share information. Statecraft. Alex created Politics and War 2.0 a couple of years ago. It was called Statecraft, and it was meant to add a bunch of new mechanics and fix some of the balancing issues with Politics and War. Ultimately, he dropped the project, and we didn't get any of the balance updates from Statecraft. Alex has since said that creating a new game isn't possible, because most of the players wouldn't join, and that he won't overhaul the war system or try to balance the game because it would be too much work, and it would upset the older players. It's kinda sad, and I hope he changes his mind on Statecraft or on balancing Politics and War in the future. He has help with development now, so it's easier than ever. Instant population. When you buy infrastructure, your population instantly increases. You can go from 10,000 people to 15 million or more by clicking one button. In Statecraft, then your population increased gradually to a cap set by your infrastructure. The admin recognizes how absurd it is, but has no plans to change it or add any elements of realism to the game. Flying tanks is still a long-running joke, since tanks can kill aircraft. CNs and activity. Most of Politics and War's original players and a significant percent of the current player base comes from Cybernations. CN players will argue that CN is a better game than PNW in most ways. But that begs the question, why are they here? There are two explanations. Firstly, the admin Kevin stopped updating the game, and the UI is super unappealing to new players. Secondly, the New Pacific Order effectively won the game, and has imposed global peace for the past half-decade. However, there was recently a global war in CN, and depending on the outcome, it's possible some CN players might return to it. I imagine some newer PNW alliances would join too, if it was possible to catch up to the older CN players. But I don't think it is. Demographics. Alex periodically surveys the community, and the results of these surveys are often released. They should be on one of the index pages too. The average age of alliances is 2 to 3 years, and the average age of players is 21. 50% of the game is from North America, and 86% of respondents claim to check the game at least once a day. Order Reich. I saved one of the most infamous and controversial topics for last. Cybernations originally became famous and popular because a German nationalist alliance used Norway's national anthem in a propaganda video, featuring what are supposedly American ships in World War II. Norway's government and their Berlin embassy were not pleased. The event got reported in major newspapers, and supposedly it was mentioned on CNN, which brought a lot of players to the game. For context, some people joined to support Nordreich, more people joined to destroy Nordreich, and most people joined just because the game sounded interesting. The propaganda video probably still survives on YouTube. When I was doing research for this video, I found they published a follow-up video called FU Norway. Tier 7. See it to believe it. Fake friends and networking. If you've ever been in high government for any alliance, then you will have made friends with government members in other alliances. Some friendships develop naturally, but a lot of them are made intentionally in order to ask you for help or information in the future. This has reached some really wacky levels too, where people meet each other IRL in order to prop up a relationship they use to gather information in a browser sim, and it's not even that strange outside of PNW. This is well established in the EVE Online community. TS sends announcements via DMs. It is very difficult to keep secrets in Politics and War because of the number and skill of spies. In order to combat spying, the alliances have come up with a number of different strategies, including sending announcements via DMs. They do this so that they can change the position of full stops and commas, as well as replace words with those of similar meaning for each individual member. If an announcement is screenshotted and leaked, then it reveals who the leaker was, because the message is unique. I will note this doesn't stop spies from sharing the basic information in the message with the public, or the entire message with the handler, but it does stop the original message being published, since it would compromise them. In short, all this work isn't to reduce spying, it's to reduce the perception of spying, because none of their messages get leaked on news servers anymore. Image edits. Another strategy used to catch spies is editing images. Some people do this by changing one pixel in an image each time they share it, so that if it's leaked, they know who it is. Rose and others bet on people being lazy and just downloading the image they send. They edit the image file using Notepad or something else, and append a series of random numbers to it. This won't break the file. If the image gets reposted to a news server, they simply download it, open the file, and check the random numbers to see who leaked it. The number of people they caught with this method is frankly stupid. The news servers have since taken to screenshotting and reducing the quality of images to avoid their sources being compromised. They may also change languages and create fake screenshots with the exact same content to avoid missing some pixel or trap. Fake logs. People have used Inspect Element on Discord to fake logs for years. Discord server profiles have made this even worse, since you can change profile pictures and nicknames to fake logs very quickly and effectively. People also delete and edit messages to misrepresent and falsify conversations. Can't really trust logs of any sort in this game. 100 spies. There are more than 100 active spies across the game. I'll make a video about this in the future, since it's fascinating, but here's a short explanation of why this is. Say you're Rose's diplomat. You need to know what your rivals are doing, so you send a spy to each of them. Now each of those rivals also needs to keep track of Rose, and each other, so they each send out a bunch of spies. It quickly exceeds 100 spies. The original spybot. Rose has been web scraping people's spy counts since at least 2018. They denied it until very recently, since very few alliances put the time into developing similar tools. Because of this asymmetry, then Rose won every in-game spy war for a very long time, and developed a reputation for being especially proficient at it. Loans of 50 billion. Yar, Seb, Syndicate, and others are loaning 10 to 50 billion at a time. Most of this goes to other top 10 alliances, or top 30 alliances if they are allies. MPO also borrowed a ton when it was around, despite being enemies with most of the lenders. This goes to show how much money is moving around, and how valuable safe investment is. The Empire of Rose. Rose has been systematically conquering other games, like MPO did in the past. They joined and ranked first in Mini-States, Lavinia, Nations Game, and a couple others in the past few years. Nations at Risk is the latest nation sin, and the only one I haven't seen them invade. $5,000 on credits. You can buy credits for other players who can then redeem them. This is probably still within the game rules as of making this video, and it's why some players have spent thousands of dollars on credits in a single month. The record for the most money spent on the game is disputed. I know of one player that spent $5,000 and another that claims to have spent $12,000. However, it's entirely possible an unknown player has spent even more. I believe there's an old interview with Alex where he claimed to have earned $10,000 in a month because of a global war while he was a teenager. 1,000 credit nations. There are players with thousands of credits. Some of these are working on behalf of alliances, like Syndicate had a stash of 800 or more credits, because you can't store credits in the bank, so it has to be stored with a government member. Others are individuals, like one person who bought the subscription for years and used his nation's daily income to buy more credits. The Wayback Machine. You can use the Wayback Machine to see old versions of Politics and War's Treaty Web. You can also use it to find old front pages for Alliance forums and websites. It's not super useful, but it can be insightful. New Treaty Web. The Alliance Treaty Web is one of the most unique things about PNW. It maps the game's politics and helps things make sense for outsiders and new players. The original Treaty Web was created for Cybernations, but it was pretty terrible. Former CN players created a modern version similar to our own, and Alex added it to the site and allowed them to edit it. However, the CN players refused to add smaller alliances to the Treaty Web, and were slow to update it, so I contacted Alex when I joined the game and asked him to change it. Alex looked into the treaty web code and found several vulnerabilities, which prompted him to recode and automate it. For years, the treaty web remained unchanged, but when I was diving into the CN forums and wiki, I found a more modern treaty web the CN Alliance had made. It allowed you to filter by treaty types and increase the number of alliances being displayed. I then contacted PNW's developers, and with a little convincing, they updated the treaty web. The treaty web is a very important part of Politics and War, and I'm glad that one of my biggest contributions to this game was prompting its improvement. If you want to see the final iceberg about Politics and War, then like and subscribe. It's free and you can always change your mind later.